So it's the summer of 1789, and the streets of New York City are just completely silent.
Right.
And not because it's a holiday or there's a curfew or anything like that.
Yeah.
It is because there's this heavy, thick iron chain that is stretched entirely across the cobblestones right outside the president's residence.
Yeah.
They've physically barricaded the street just to stop carriage wheels from rattling. And the reason for this, like, extreme measure is that upstairs, George Washington, who is, the supposedly invincible hero of the American Revolution, is in absolute agony.
Hmm.
And the entire American experiment is basically on the verge of dying right along with him.
It's just a phenomenal image to start with, because it instantly shatters the illusion we have of that era. Like when we look at a marble statue of Washington or, the Washington Monument, we see permanence.
Right, totally.
We see this impenetrable deity who just, stepped into the presidency and flawlessly executed this master plan. But the historical reality of 1789 was much closer to a man walking a tightrope over a volcano while suffering from a septic fever.
Yeah, which is wild to think about. So today we are taking a deep dive into a very specific, really critical window of time. We're looking at 1784 to 1792.
Yeah, that crucial first window.
Exactly. And we've pulled together this massive stack of constitutional histories, political psychology profiles, and most importantly, Washington's own private correspondence. Our mission here is to kind of deconstruct that statuesque myth.
Right.
We are looking at the agonizing psychological pressures, the literal physical fragility we just mentioned, and the profound moral compromises that really defined his first term. We're talking about the ultimate reluctant sovereign.
And to understand that reluctance, I mean, we actually have to back up just a few years to December 1783. The Revolutionary War is won. And Washington does something that genuinely stuns the globe. He surrenders his military commission to Congress and just goes home to Mount Vernon as a private citizen.
Which, I mean, historically speaking, that was unheard of, right?
Oh, completely.
The historical playbook basically says, you win a revolution, you leverage the army you command, and you become the emperor.
Right.
Like Julius Caesar did it, Napoleon would eventually do it.
It was the expectation. I mean, King George III supposedly said that if Washington gave up power, he'd be the greatest man in the world. And Washington was highly conscious of those optics. He adopted this persona of Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, the Roman statesman.
Oh, right, the Cincinnatus thing.
Yeah, the guy who was given absolute dictatorial power to save Rome from an invasion. And then the very day the war was won, he handed the power back and literally went back to his plow. By mirroring that Roman ideal, Washington secured this flawless legacy.
Yeah.
I mean, he proved to a highly skeptical world, especially those European monarchs, that he harbored zero tyrannical ambitions. He became this ultimate, untarnished Republican icon.
But let me push back on that for just a second.
Sure, yeah.
Was it purely this noble civic virtue, or was it just really incredible PR?
That's the question.
Because, I mean, walking away when the post-war economy is in total shambles feels a little bit like abandoning a sinking ship just to save your own reputation. Because right after he leaves, the country he helped create basically starts falling apart.
It does.
The Articles of Confederation were the governing document at the time, and by all accounts, they were just a disaster.
It's a very fair critique, and it's actually the exact tension that Washington himself was wrestling with. The Articles of Confederation were just structurally impotent.
Yeah.
To put it simply, the federal government had no power to levy taxes. So if they needed money to pay off the massive war debt, they basically had to ask the states politely for contributions.
Which goes about as well as you expect.
Right, exactly. The states predictably just said no. So you have a bankrupt national government, you have unpaid military veterans, and a really severe economic depression across the board.
Which boils over into Shays' Rebellion, right?
Yeah.
In Massachusetts in 1786,
Yeah.
you have these armed farmers, and a lot of them are actually Revolutionary War veterans, physically shutting down courts because they are being heavily taxed by the state, and they're being thrown into debtor's prison when they can't pay with hard currency, which, by the way, didn't even exist in circulation.
It didn't. And if you read the letters flying around the colonial elite at this time, I mean, the panic is just palpable. Henry Knox, who was Washington's old artillery commander, he writes these frantic dispatches down to Mount Vernon.
Just freaking out.
Oh, completely freaking out. Knox is terrified. He tells Washington that these rebels believe that since the property of the United States was saved by the joint efforts of everyone, it ought to be the common property of everyone.
Oh, wow. So they see it as a class war.
Exactly.
Right.
To the conservative propertied class, this wasn't just a tax protest. It was this terrifying descent into mass wealth redistribution and just total anarchy.
Knox actually warns him, doesn't he, that without a complete restructuring of the government to secure property rights, they are looking at total collapse.
He does.
And Washington himself writes to James Madison, admitting the nation is, quote, fast verging to anarchy and confusion. So a constitutional convention is called for May 1787 in Philadelphia, and they know they absolutely need Washington there.
Yeah, it's non-negotiable.
Right, the convention has no legitimacy without his physical presence, but he refuses to go.
He does. And it is sheer paralyzing terror that is keeping him at Mount Vernon. He writes to his confidant, David Humphreys, who actually advises him to stay home.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Humphreys tells him that Washington's character is, quote, the last stake which America has to play. If he goes to this convention and it fails to produce a working government, which honestly everyone thought was the most likely outcome, he attaches his pristine, flawless reputation to a historic failure.
Okay, let's translate this to a modern scenario because I think it helps. It trends kind of like a film director who just made the greatest, most universally acclaimed, culturally defining debut movie in the history of cinema.
I like this, yeah.
And now the studio executives are showing up at his house demanding he direct a sequel. But the script is a total mess, the actors are fighting, and there's absolutely no budget. The pressure to not ruin the legacy of that original masterpiece is just paralyzing. Like, why would you ever walk back on set?
That analogy perfectly captures his internal state. I mean, he calls it the peculiar circumstances of my case in a letter he writes to Edmund Randolph. He's trapped in this prison of his own perfection. And compounding this was this severe hereditary dilemma he was dealing with.
The Cincinnati thing.
Yes, Washington was the president of the Society of Cincinnati, which was this exclusive group of Revolutionary War officers.
And Thomas Jefferson was, like, highly suspicious of that group, right?
He despised it.
Because Jefferson saw this hereditary society of military men passing down memberships to their eldest sons, and he thought, wait a minute, this is just the embryo of a new European aristocracy.
Exactly that fear. And the society was holding its general meeting in Philadelphia at the exact same time the Constitutional Convention was scheduled.
Oh, no way. I didn't realize the timing was that close.
Exactly at the same time. So Washington was terrified that if he showed up in Philadelphia, people would look at it and think he was there to conspire with his military officers to stage some kind of coup and install an aristocratic government. He was completely obsessed with avoiding any taint of ambition.
So how does Henry Knox finally convince him to get off the farm and go?
Well, Knox is just a brilliant psychological operator here.
Yeah.
In March of 1787, he writes this letter that completely flips the script on Washington's fears. He just maneuvers him right into a corner.
What does he say?
Knox essentially says, look, if you stay home and the Republic collapses into civil war and gets carved up by European empires, your legacy as the father of your country perishes with it anyway.
Oh, wow.
Right. Your reputation is tied to the survival of the nation, whether you participate or not. But if you go and we create a strong system with your signature on it, it guarantees your title for all future ages.
Wow. So he just completely weaponizes Washington's own vanity.
Completely.
The Knox is basically saying, you know, your legacy burns down if you stay on the couch, so you might as well come to Philadelphia and try to put out the fire.
Exactly.
Hmm.
He left Washington with action as literally the only viable option for legacy preservation.
Mm-hmm.
So Washington accepts the burden. He travels to Philadelphia. He presides over the convention in almost total stoic silence. And his mere presence gives them the political cover they need to tear up the Articles of Confederation entirely and draft the modern Constitution.
Right. But, you know, agreeing to be the figurehead of the convention was one thing. Actually taking office as the first president of the United States under this new, totally untested document, that was something else entirely. The moment he takes office, the sheer psychological weight of setting every single historical precedent begins to take a massive, literal toll on his body.
And we really need to emphasize how unprecedented this somatic toll was for him. Washington's entire brand was physical invincibility.
Right. He was huge for the time, right?
He was, and he was tough. I mean, he had survived smallpox in Barbados. He survived that brutal winter at Valley Forge. During the French and Indian War, he literally had multiple horses shot out from under him and bullets tear through his coat, all without ever suffering an incapacitating injury. He was a force of nature.
But then jump to the spring of 1789. He's unanimously elected. He has to travel from Virginia up to New York City, which was the temporary capital at the time, for his inauguration. And you would think he'd be elated, right? Triumphant.
Right.
But he writes this letter to Knox describing this journey, and the language is just chilling. He says his feelings were those of, quote, a culprit going to his place of execution.
And he felt that way because he knew the Constitution was just a theoretical piece of paper. It was a skeletal outline. He wrote to the radical English intellectual Catherine Macaulay, who we will definitely discuss a bit later.
Oh, for sure.
But he told her that he was stepping onto untrodden ground. He realized that every single thing he did, from how he addressed Congress to how he managed a simple diplomatic dinner, would be drawn into permanent precedent. The psychological pressure of that was just suffocating.
And his body just completely rebels against it, which brings us back to that terrifying scene we started with at the top of the deep dive. Just 2 months into his presidency, in the summer of 1789, he develops this massive malignant carbuncle on his upper left thigh.
Right.
And we are talking about a severe septic staphylococcic infection. He's completely bedridden for 6 weeks.
Yeah, and this is an era long before antibiotics, long before germ theory. A septic abscess of this magnitude wasn't just a bad health scare, it was practically his death sentence. The visceral details from the medical accounts of that summer are staggering.
Yeah, they're rough.
Dr. Samuel Bard, who was a very prominent physician of the time, is brought in. And he determines the only way to save the president is to incise and drain this massive infection.
Without anesthesia.
Without anesthesia. Washington simply grips the bed sheets and tells Bard to cut. And he survives the brutal procedure, but he is left incredibly debilitated. When he finally has to travel again, he is so weakened that his presidential coach actually has to be radically reconfigured.
Wow.
They essentially turn it into a rolling bed so he can travel lying completely flat because he physically cannot sit up.
That is just, let's pause and consider the macro implications of this for a second. Today, if a president is incapacitated, there is a massive institutional framework. We have the 25th Amendment, a clear line of succession, vast federal agencies that just, keep humming along. But in 1789, if Dr. Bard's scalpel slips or if that infection reaches his bloodstream and he goes into shock, what actually happens to the United States?
It likely ends immediately.
Really, just immediately over.
Yes, there was absolutely no institutional inertia at that point. The survival of this incredibly fragile constitutional coalition, which, remember, barely got ratified in the first place, was entirely tethered to the biological pulse of one man. Washington was the only unifying gravitational force holding together violently opposed factions. If he dies in the summer of 1789, the nation almost certainly fractures into regional confederacies right then and there. The North and South were already deeply, deeply at odds over finance and the institution of slavery.
That is deeply unsettling to think about. The entire American experiment depended on one guy's immune system fighting off a staph infection.
Yeah.
And incredibly, he has another massive relapse the very next year. In 1790, he is struck down by a severe bout of influenza that rapidly develops into pneumonia. And the medical logs from that time note a soaring fever, bloody sputum, profound delirium. I mean, Thomas Jefferson and the rest of the cabinet were quietly preparing for his death.
They were. But miraculously, his physical constitution holds together again. But while he is fighting for his life in his bedchamber, the administrative machinery of his brand new government is spectacularly failing out on the western frontier.
Right.
And this failure triggers an unprecedented psychological rupture for a man who prided himself on total, absolute emotional control.
Yeah, we are talking about St. Clair's defeat in 1791. So if the administration was managing to project this illusion of stability in Philadelphia, the frontier was a total disaster. European-American settlers are aggressively pushing into the Northwest Territory, which is, modern-day Ohio and Indiana, and they're severely encroaching on indigenous lands. Tensions explode into open warfare. So Washington orders General Arthur St. Clair to mount a decisive military expedition against the Northwestern Confederacy of Native Americans.
And Washington actually brings St. Clair in before the deployment and gives him a highly specific, very direct warning. Washington is drawing on his own very painful, very visceral memories of fighting in the wilderness during the French and Indian War decades earlier.
Yeah, where he learned the hard way.
Exactly. He looks St. Clair in the eye and tells him, above all else, to beware of surprise attacks. He explicitly warns that native forces will wait for a moment of relaxed discipline, usually right at dawn, and that's when they'll hit.
But the expedition itself is just a logistical nightmare. It is almost comical how badly equipped they are. St. Clair is suffering from such severe gout that he can barely walk, let alone mount a horse.
Right.
He has to be carried around on a litter. The militia they raise is totally untrained. Disease is rampant in the camps. There is mass desertion every single night. And the food supplies that were provided by these corrupt contractors are literally rotting.
It was a catastrophic recipe.
Oh.
And on the morning of November 4th, 1791, a highly organized, tactically brilliant coalition of forces led by Little Turtle of the Miamis, Blue Jacket of the Shawnees, and Bacongahelas of the Delawares launches a devastating surprise attack on St. Clair's unfortified camp near the Wabash River.
Right at dawn, just like Washington warned.
Just like he warned.
And the numbers from this battle are just staggering. It remains the most disastrous defeat in the history of the U.S. military and the largest victory ever won by Native Americans against European American forces. I mean, out of roughly 1,000 officers and men in St. Clair's camp, over 630 are killed. Hundreds more are wounded. When you look at the primary accounts, only 24 men escaped completely unharmed.
Yeah, to put that in perspective, when people think of famous military disasters, they usually think of Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn.
Right?
The percentage of forces lost in St. Clair's defeat eclipses Custer by miles. The devastation was absolute. It was the total annihilation of the standing American army.
And the way Washington finds out about this is intensely cinematic. The capital has temporarily moved to Philadelphia at this point. Washington is hosting a formal dinner party, and his trusted personal secretary, Tobias Lear, is suddenly called out of the dining room. An express rider has arrived, covered in mud with these desperately urgent dispatches. Lear reads the reports, walks back into the dining room, and leans down to whisper the horrifying news into Washington's ear.
And if you read Tobias Lear's diary, he describes this moment vividly. This is where we see the absolute rigid control of Washington, the public figure. I mean, he receives news that his entire army has been butchered, but he doesn't gasp. He doesn't drop his fork.
Wow.
He maintains perfect stoic composure. He returns to the conversation, engages with his guests, and finishes the entire evening without a single person at that table suspecting that the nation's military has just been wiped out.
But the moment the last guest leaves and the doors close, the mask completely slips. Lear's diary describes Washington starting to pace the room, silently at first, and then he just explodes in this unprecedented, violent rage. He starts roaring. He swears at the betrayal of his explicit orders. He yells, "St. Clair's defeated, routed the officers, nearly all killed, and a surprise into the bargain." He is furious that St. Clair ignored his one specific warning and allowed the army to be slaughtered.
And Lear is just sitting there in a chair, motionless, while the storm of emotion breaks over him. It's just a fascinating psychological moment. Washington built his entire persona on this hyper-vigilant emotional control. But when the machinery of his fragile government failed so spectacularly, he reached the absolute limit of his psychological endurance.
So he comes back from this dinner party having just realized his military is entirely impotent in the West.
Right.
If you're Washington and you know your government is actually incredibly weak, how do you project strength so European empires don't immediately sense the vulnerability and invade? Well, you put on a crown or the closest thing to it. He overcompensates for the fragility of the state by leaning into extreme vanity and majesty in the capital.
Which brings us right into the famous title controversy of 1789. The First Federal Congress was locked in a bitter, protracted dispute over what to actually call the new chief executive. Vice President John Adams and a conservative faction in the Senate wanted a grandiose aristocratic title.
Yeah.
They argued it was functionally necessary to command respect on the global stage, especially when dealing with the entrenched European monarchies.
And the titles they were throwing around are wild. They debated His Excellency, His Majesty the President, and my personal favorite, His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of their Liberties.
It's a mouthful. We view it as a joke now, but Adams was deadly serious. He believed that without a majestic title, the common people wouldn't respect the office. However, the House of Representatives, led by James Madison, was adamantly opposed. They recognized the glaring hypocrisy of it. They argued, you cannot fight an agonizing 8-year revolution to destroy a monarchy and then essentially crown an elective king.
Right.
Ultimately, the House won, and the simple, unadorned title, Mr. President, prevailed.
But here's the irony. Washington publicly accepts Mr. President, but he immediately surrounds himself with monarchical trappings anyway. He cultivates this terrifying, unapproachable majesty. Like, if you're a citizen in 1789 and you get an audience with him, you don't get a handshake.
No.
He categorically refused to shake hands. You only received a stiff, formal bow. He dressed in black velvet suits with a ceremonial sword at his hip and yellow gloves.
The transportation alone was a spectacle. He navigated the muddy streets of the capital in an incredibly ornate cream-colored coach drawn by 6 perfectly matched horses, flanked by liveried servants.
Like Cinderella.
Exactly. Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, actually excoriated him for this later on, accusing him of possessing the natural ingratitude of a monarch. But Washington deeply believed that to insulate the office from pure, volatile populism, the executive needed to possess an unapproachable sovereign aura.
And he also claimed to be this Olympian, nonpartisan figure, right? His whole brand was being above the political fray, constantly warning everyone that factionalism and political parties would destroy the Union. But looking at his actions, that was a massive hypocrisy, too.
It was a very carefully maintained facade. While projecting absolute neutrality, Washington was secretly and systematically favoring Alexander Hamilton, the centralized financial vision, over Thomas Jefferson's decentralized agrarian vision. Behind closed doors, Washington consistently backed Hamilton's treasury plans, the assumption of state debts, the creation of a national bank, and a heavily pro-British foreign policy.
Which drove Jefferson and James Madison absolutely crazy. But because Washington had this towering, untouchable prestige, this marble statue aura, they couldn't attack him directly without looking like treasonous ingrates. So they had to fight proxy wars in the press, funding partisan newspapers to attack Hamilton instead, knowing full well Washington was the one approving the policies.
But this dynamic raises a really important question about how Washington handled the actual constitutional mechanics of his power, which leads us to his agonizing decision over the apportionment veto of 1792.
Oh, man. Let's pause and translate what happened here, because the contrast is wild. Washington is riding around in a 6-horse cream coach, acting like a king. But then we look at his first presidential veto, and he is paralyzed over a math equation.
Yeah.
So the Apportionment Act of 1792 was essentially a census bill to decide how many representatives each state got in Congress. Hamilton designed a mathematical formula that took the leftover fractions of a state's population and used those remainders to give extra representatives to certain states, which conveniently happened to be northern states that supported Hamilton.
Shocker. Jefferson and his ally, Edmund Randolph, look at this math and argue it is blatantly unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution mandates a strict maximum of 1 representative per 30,000 constituents. Jefferson argues that Hamilton's formula violates this by not applying a uniform divisor, meaning you have to divide the total population by a single number to get the representation rather than manipulating the leftover fractions to pack the House.
Okay, I see.
But Hamilton and Knox urge Washington to sign it anyway, arguing the Constitution's wording is ambiguous and the executive should just defer to the legislature.
And Washington agonizes over this for days. The congressional vote was strictly geographical. The North voted for it, the South voted against it. Washington is a Virginian. He is terrified that if he vetoes it, it will look like naked partisan favoritism toward the South and ruin his carefully crafted image of national unity. But ultimately, he sides with Jefferson's strict constitutional math and vetoes the bill. But hold on, I have to point out the massive contradiction here. He's putting on velvet suits and a sword, refusing to shake hands, essentially cosplaying as a European king. But he agonizes for days over a mathematical fraction in a census bill because he's terrified of stepping 1 inch beyond the literal text of the Constitution. Like, how do you reconcile that?
That contradiction is the defining mechanism of Washington's presidency. He fundamentally believed the image of the executive needed to be regal and terrifying, to command respect from foreign powers and project stability to the masses. But the actual mechanics of the executive power, how laws were passed, how representation was calculated, had to be strictly, rigidly constitutional to avoid actual tyranny.
Interesting.
Yeah, he drew incredibly hard lines for himself between optics and structural power.
But that obsession with strict boundaries and maintaining rigid control didn't just apply to the Constitution. It extended deeply into the domestic sphere, dictating his fiercely conflicting views on gender, intellect, and most horrifyingly, human bondage.
Yes. To truly understand the reluctant sovereign, we have to examine the darkest moral compromises of his first term. This is where we see a stark, almost unbelievable chasm between his private intellectual sympathies and his public logistical actions.
Let's start with gender dynamics during this era. The birth of the Republic brought about a new social ideology that historians call Republican motherhood. The concept was that women were suddenly elevated to the status of civic educators. Their primary political purpose was to raise virtuous, educated sons who would sustain the republic.
It sounds like an elevation in status on the surface, but functionally, it was a mechanism to strictly enforce boundaries.
Right.
It justified a limited education for women enough so they could teach their sons history and morality, but it explicitly excluded them from formal power. It barred them from the ballot box and expected them to remain entirely silent on political discourse in any public or social setting.
And Martha Washington, the inaugural First Lady, or Lady Washington as she was referred to, was forced to be the ultimate enforcer of these boundaries, even though it made her utterly miserable. There are letters where she laments her position, stating she felt more like a state prisoner than anything else.
The social architecture of the new presidency was incredibly rigid. They established a Republican court to manage access. Tuesdays were levees exclusively for men, Thursdays were official state dinners, and Fridays were Martha's drawing room receptions, which were mixed gender.
Okay.
And Martha perfectly executed the performative aspects of her role, but the rules were suffocating. She announced that the general retired exactly at 9 p.m., no exceptions, and most importantly, if any guest attempted to bring up politics at her Friday drawing rooms, she would actively, firmly, and immediately change the subject.
She was forced to act as the gatekeeper of a strictly non-political domestic sphere. But here's the incredible contrast. Washington, our private correspondence, reveals a deep, profound intellectual respect for female thinkers that he publicly denied them. We have these rich transatlantic letters between him and the radical English historian Catherine Macaulay.
Macaulay was an intellectual powerhouse of the era. She actually visited Mount Vernon for 10 days in 1785. They spent hours discussing political philosophy and military history. He even gave her unrestricted access to his private military records.
Wow, really?
Yeah. After he was elected president, he wrote to her with striking vulnerability, confiding his deepest political anxieties about walking on that untrodden ground.
She was explicitly warning him about aristocratic elements creeping into the new legislature. She was functioning as his intellectual peer. It is a stunning hypocrisy. I mean, he is sharing his deepest, most agonizing constitutional fears with a woman in private across the ocean, while simultaneously enforcing a system at home where his own wife has to aggressively change the subject if politics comes up at a Friday night party.
It highlights a persistent theme with Washington: the private intellectual versus the public enforcer of the status quo. He often understood what was intellectually right, but defaulted to what maintained order and control.
Yeah.
And nowhere is this chasm more devastating, more horrifying than in his views and actions regarding slavery.
Right. Over the course of his life, his attitude towards slavery shifted from uncritical acceptance as a young man to private distaste and economic frustration later on. In his private correspondence during this era, particularly his letters to the Marquis de Lafayette in 1786, he expresses what sound like genuine, heartfelt abolitionist sympathies.
Lafayette, the French aristocrat who fought alongside Washington, had established an experimental plantation in the French colony of Cayenne. His intention was to educate and gradually emancipate the enslaved laborers there. Washington wrote a beautiful letter to Lafayette, praising this experiment as a generous and noble proof of your humanity.
Yeah.
He lamented, "Would to God a like spirit would diffuse itself generally into the minds of the people of this country, but I despair of seeing it."
He privately wishes for abolition. He says he despairs that America doesn't share Lafayette's spirit. But when the federal capital moves to Philadelphia in 1790, we see a horrifying public pivot that completely betrays those private sentiments.
Because Philadelphia is in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania had passed the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, the law had a very specific mechanism. It stated that any enslaved person brought into the state by a non-resident who remained for 6 continuous months was automatically legally entitled to their freedom.
So when Washington moves to Philadelphia to govern, he brings several enslaved individuals with him from Mount Vernon to serve his household. This includes Ona Judge, Hercules, and Christopher Shields. Washington argues that his residency is merely incidental because he's a federal government official serving the nation.
Right, a technicality.
But he is terrified that the highly active local Quaker abolitionists in Philadelphia will inform his enslaved workers of their rights and entice them to seek their legal freedom.
And we have to dive into the intensely cold financial calculation here. Many of the enslaved individuals at Mount Vernon were not owned by Washington outright. They were what was known as dower slaves.
Let's break down exactly what that means, because it is the key to this whole dark maneuvering.
Sure. So, when Martha's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, died without a will, Martha received a life estate, a dower share in 1/3 of his massive property, which included hundreds of enslaved people. George and Martha had the use of their labor, but they did not legally own them. They belonged to the Custis estate, destined for Martha's heirs.
Okay, I see.
Washington calculated that if these dower slaves achieved freedom under Pennsylvania law while in his custody, he wouldn't just lose their labor. He would be legally and financially liable to reimburse the Custis estate for their total monetary value.
It would have ruined his wealth. So to circumvent this abolition law, Washington, the exact same man who just spent days agonizing over whether a mathematical fraction in a census bill was constitutional, designs a systematic, illegal rotation scheme to deny human beings their freedom. Every 6 months, he orders his enslaved workers to be transported across state lines, usually back to Virginia, to interrupt the residency and reset the 6-month legal clock.
And the documentary evidence of this operation is chilling. We aren't guessing at his motives here. In a letter to his secretary, Tobias Lear, written on April 12, 1791, Washington gives explicit, detailed instructions on how to execute this rotation using deliberate, calculated deception. He writes that if they have to send the enslaved people back to Virginia to prevent their emancipation, it must be done under pretext that may deceive both them and the public.
Reading that letter is a genuinely gut-wrenching moment. He literally lists the tactics to trick them. He instructs Lear to send Ona Judge back under the false pretext of just being a temporary travel companion for Martha.
Yeah.
Hercules is sent back under the guise of returning home to cook a specific meal. Christopher Shields is kept in Philly because he's a minor, and Washington calculates he's legally less of a flight risk. It is just so methodical.
Washington justifies this elaborate deception by writing to Lear that the idea of freedom might be too great a temptation for them to resist. He feared that if they believed they had a legal right to freedom, it might make them, in his own words, insolent in a state of slavery. He explicitly orders Lear to keep these sentiments and the true nature of the rotation strictly secret from the public.
I can't get over the cognitive dissonance here. How does a man write a beautiful, sweeping letter to Lafayette wishing for a spirit of abolition and then sit down at his desk and calculate a literal deceptive rotation schedule to trick a young woman like Ona Judge out of her legal freedom? It is incredibly dark.
It dismantles the marble myth entirely. It exposes the core tragedy of Washington, the politician versus Washington the man. When pushed to the absolute limit, he always inevitably prioritized the economic stability of his estate and the political stability of the fragile Union over fundamental human rights. He viewed slavery as a tragic, inherited system that he claimed to be trapped in, yet he actively, deceptively, and illegally maneuvered the vast machinery of his presidential power to maintain his absolute dominion over human lives.
And he didn't just do it in the shadows of his own household. At the close of this era, he signs the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This wasn't just a minor administrative bill. This was a draconian law that established a federal mechanism allowing enslavers, or their hired agents, to cross state lines into free states, physically seize alleged escapees, and bring them before a local magistrate.
And the legal mechanics of that act were devastating. To prove ownership and drag a human being back into bondage, the enslaver only needed to provide a simple oral testimony or an affidavit. The law explicitly denied the accused black person any right to a jury trial or the right to testify on their own behalf.
Wow.
Furthermore, it levied massive financial penalties, $500, which was an astronomical sum at the time, on anyone who harbored a fugitive or hindered their capture.
The man who praised Lafayette's emancipation dream willingly signed into law a mandate that imperiled every single free black person in America. It facilitated a nationwide, legally sanctioned kidnapping apparatus. He spent his entire first term agonizing over lines: how much power is too much, where does the Constitution end, who gets freedom and who doesn't. He built the office of the presidency while navigating these extreme moral hypocrisies. And yet, if we look at the office he built, the limits he obsessed over, if he saw the presidency today, it would be utterly unrecognizable to him.
Absolutely. If we shift to a macro-historical view, looking strictly and exclusively through the eyes of the George Washington of 1792, the modern American presidency would be the manifestation of his absolute deepest constitutional nightmares.
Let's go back to the veto contrast for a second. We talked about him agonizing over the exact wording of Article 1, Section 2, consulting his entire cabinet just to justify vetoing an apportionment act based on a math formula. He viewed the veto not as a way to enforce his personal policy preferences, but as a dire emergency safeguard only to be used when a law explicitly violated the written text of the Constitution.
Exactly the right framing. So if you transport the Washington of 1792 to the 21st century, the modern proliferation of executive orders, which are often used routinely by modern presidents to bypass legislative gridlock when Congress won't act, would absolutely appall him. To his 18th century mind, an executive decree that bypasses the elected legislature looks exactly like the royal decrees of the British monarch. He just fought an agonizing 8-year war to defeat.
The analogy I keep coming back to is that it's like he spent 8 years carefully building a wooden fence to keep a dog in the yard. He wanted the executive branch just strong enough to bark and keep foreign intruders out, but strictly confined by the wooden slats of the Constitution. But by leaving the gates of executive privilege slightly unlocked, we took that blueprint and accidentally built a Jurassic Park enclosure for a T-Rex. And the modern administrative state is the T-Rex.
That is precisely how he would see it. The concept of the modern administrative state alone would shock him to his core. The idea of vast, unelected executive agencies wielding massive regulatory authority over the economy, the environment, and private lives without continuous, direct, line-by-line legislative oversight would seem like tyrannical overreach.
Yeah.
It violates his strict division of mechanics.
But the ultimate horror for him, the thing that would make him realize his wooden fence had completely failed, would have to be the nuclear codes.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Remember, this is a man who believed that even deploying a few under-equipped militia regiments to the western frontier to fight St. Clair's disastrous battle required agonizing deliberation, logistical debate, and strict deference to congressional funding.
Right.
The existence of the nuclear briefcase, which grants a single, solitary individual the unilateral capacity to obliterate entire civilizations in a matter of minutes without a congressional declaration of war, without a debate that is the antithesis of his constitutional vision. That is absolute, unchecked sovereign power.
So, to the Washington of 1792, the modern presidency isn't a republic at all.
No. To him, it is a leviathan. It is the very elective monarchy that his harshest critics, the ones who fought John Adams over the His Highness title, warned about from the very beginning. He spent his first term trying to bind the executive within the strict literal confines of a written constitution. He would view the modern iteration of his office as a catastrophic, systemic failure of those restraints.
Let's wrap this up and look at the whole picture we've painted today. The George Washington that emerges from 1784 to 1792 is a man of immense, agonizing psychological complexity. He truly is the reluctant sovereign. He was a man trapped by his own legend, driven back into public life not by raw ambition, but by a paranoid terror that if the country fell to anarchy, it would destroy his pristine legacy. Under unimaginable pressure, while surviving near-fatal illnesses and horrifying military catastrophes on the frontier, he managed to build the functional machinery of a nation.
But that foundation was built on profound, deeply unsettling contradictions. He modeled nonpartisanship while secretly engineering a centralized Hamiltonian state. He respected female intellect and private correspondence while strictly enforcing their public exclusion from the political sphere. And most damningly, he privately mourned the institution of slavery while aggressively, deceptively utilizing the power of his office to bypass abolition laws and expand the national machinery of human bondage.
Which brings us back to where we started. We look at the marble statue. We look at the flawless, unyielding monument that never cracks, never sweats, and never makes a moral compromise.
And that raises a lingering question, perhaps the most vital one we can ask about his early presidency. Washington's greatest fear in 1787, when he was sitting at Mount Vernon dreading the Constitutional Convention, was that participating in the government would ruin his perfect, unblemished legacy.
Right.
Knowing everything we now know about the agonizing compromises he made, from the calculated deception of enslaved people to the monarchical vanity he indulged to project strength, we have to ask ourselves, did he actually save his flawless legacy by becoming president, or did taking the office reveal the very human, deeply flawed man hiding behind the marble statue?
Something to think about the next time you look at a monument. Until next time.